Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley. He joins us from the State Department in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Iran is going through what some call an unprecedented wave of protests since a 22-year-old woman by the name of Mahsa Amini died on September 16th after her arrest by the morality police in Tehran for not wearing properly the mandatory headscarf. Despite the ensuing brutal crackdown, the protests continue, especially this Wednesday, which marks 40 days since her death, the end of the mourning period in Iran. You recently said the protesters were demonstrating for their government to respect, quote unquote, their human rights, but it seems they're demanding more than respect. They're saying death to the dictator. It seems they want regime change.
So first, as you say, today is a very important day for so many in Iran, marking the 40 days since the brutal death of Mahsa Amini while she was in the custody of the so-called morality police. And I think you're seeing across Iran protest demonstrations by people who have shown persistence, courage, creativity in the face of brutal crackdown and at great personal risk. So I think that's where our eyes on focused on what's happening there, and I'll discuss later, I'm sure, the actions that we've taken today to sanction those responsible for the crackdown. Now, you've referred to something I said. I've immediately corrected what I said the next day, because I don't mean, it's not for me, it's not for the U.S. government to characterize what the aspirations of the Iranian people or the Iranian protesters are. Only they can do that. What we can do is support them, support their fundamental rights, and sanction and shine a spotlight on those who are using extreme violence to suppress them. That's what we've been doing alongside our efforts to make sure that Iranians have access to the internet so they could talk to each other and they could communicate with the outside world.
Right. You mentioned sanction. The Biden administration has imposed some sanctions, the European Union as well. Is it enough, or are more sanctions in the works? Because, as we said, the protest continues, the crackdown continues.
Well, as we speak, just at this very moment, we're announcing a slew of new sanctions, which are going to be aimed at leaders of the IRGC that have been directly involved in the crackdown across the country, prison officials who've been responsible, in particular the notorious Evin prison, and we're going up and down the chain, high-level officials, but also lower-level officials who've been involved in violent suppression of protesters who may have thought that they could hide behind the anonymity, but we're going to name and shame them as well. And at the same time, we're going after those who are trying to censor and surveil the Iranian people, the Iranian protesters. So more sanctions that we have imposed just today, on this day, the 40th day of Mahsa Amini's tragic death.
Right. Could those sanctions involve President Rouhani, for instance? I mean, that's what some officials in the U.S. are calling for.
He is already sanctioned, as I'm sure you know, and has been for some time.
Right. Some are also suggesting creating a UN mechanism to track abuses like the ones we have for Syria and Myanmar. Would the U.S. be in favor of creating such a mechanism for what's happening right now in Iran?
So we're exploring all kinds of international mechanisms with our partners across the world, obviously European partners, but also partners from the global south, so many of whom have been outraged by what they're seeing happen in the violent crackdown against peaceful protesters. So we're looking at what we can do to make sure that we could hold those responsible for this violent crackdown accountable.
Right. There is also obviously a slate of sanctions for Iran's alleged role in Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk about Iranian drones being used by Russia, even Iranian military personnel on the ground in Crimea to help Moscow carry out those drone attacks in Ukraine. Are you seeing further evidence of Iranian involvement alongside Russia?
Well, let's already say and make clear what we know. We know that Iran has been providing drones, dozens of drones, hundreds perhaps, to Russia. We know that they've been providing training to Russian operators, and we know that those drones have been used by Russia, again, to target civilians and civilian infrastructure. finally, we know that the Iranians are so embarrassed by this that they continue to lie in the face of mounting evidence of this transfer of drones. So we think the international community as a whole is focused on this because it really is quite extraordinary to see Iran participating in this war of aggression, unprovoked war of aggression by Russia at great cost to the Ukrainian people. We will continue to sanction anyone who's involved in those transfers and will continue to put forward all the evidence we have, but I think it's been clear enough now. It was shown at the United Nations with an expert that was testifying. It's clear for everyone to see, first and foremost, the Ukrainian people who are victims of these drones, and we will not let up to make sure that Iran is held to account for that action as well.
Right. You led the indirect talks with Iran over its nuclear program. Given what's happening right now, are those talks dead or simply on hold?
They're not on the agenda, Mark. I mean, let's be clear. We are focused on where there's movement. There's been no movement in the nuclear talks since September. Iran has put forward a position that is wholly incompatible with a revival of the deal. So we're focused on where there is movement, and the movement is on the streets of Iran because these protesters have been coming out every day peacefully, and the eyes of the world are on that, and the eyes of the world are on the other issue that you mentioned, which is Iran's transfer of UAVs, which are being used by Russia to kill Ukrainians. That's what we're focused on because that's what's happening as we speak.
So there are no negotiations anymore with Iran on the nuclear issue as we speak, correct?
There have been no negotiations now for some time. That's correct.
Right. On October the 23rd, the Iranian foreign minister said Iran had received a message from the U.S. 3 days earlier, that is October the 20th, saying that the Americans are in a hurry to reach an agreement with Iran. So did you convey such a message to Tehran?
Of course not. And this is the same people who are saying that Mahsa Amini died from natural causes, the same people who are denying that Iran transferred drones to Russia. So I think we could take all of it for what it's worth. I think that if we were to convey a message to Iran, it would be very simple. Stop killing your people and stop transferring drones to Russia to kill Ukrainians. That would be our message. The rest is as true as the other allegations that I referred to.
Right. What seems to be true, and you alluded to that, is that we were very, very close to a deal in August, according to Iranian, European, U.S. official. And this was before the crackdown, which led to the situation we just discussed. What happened?
What happened is very simple. We made it, and it's not just us, it's the Europeans said the same thing, including the European Union, the mediator. Iran suddenly reversed course, put on the table demands that are completely incompatible with a return to the JCPOA. That's what happened, and that's why our focus right now is on what seems to be mattering to the Iranian people, which is the protest against their regime, and again, what the situation in Russia with Iran transferring those deadly drones.
Right. You mentioned the internet. The U.S. has also loosened sanctions on tech companies that may help Iranian citizens evade the government control of the internet. Obviously, there is the example of Ukraine, where Elon Musk provided the Starlink terminals. Is this what the U.S. has in mind to help the Iranian people communicate with each other and with the outside world? Is this basically what's in the work?
So I'm not going to get into the specifics. What I can say is that we've been in touch with tech companies quite aggressively since we've announced this license, which will make it easier for tech companies to provide assistance to Iranians who want to communicate, who want to escape the censorship that their government is trying to impose. And so we're talking to them about what they can do to make clear that we are not going to sanction activities that they may have thought sanctionable before. We're loosening that so that we can make sure that Iranians have as much of an ability as possible to communicate to each other at a time when their government is trying to prevent that, and they could communicate it to the outside world and hear from the outside world at a time when they are demonstrating such courage in fighting for the fundamental freedoms.
Just the last issue, the issue of citizens of the United States and other Western countries held in Iran. Iran released an American, Bakr Namazi, recently. Are there still discussions about the release of his son, Siamak, of other U.S. citizens? We also know that France has, for instance, 5 citizens it considers hostages in Iran. Is Iran still talking indirectly to you about releasing them as a leverage maybe to get some relief from all the pressure it's getting on right now?
So first, I think we have to make the point that how outrageous it is that Iran would be using innocent people as pawns. And you mentioned French. There's also people from other countries across Europe. And 3 of our citizens, you mentioned Siamak, it's also Imad and Murad. And all 3 of them should never have been in prison in the first place. They should be out as soon as possible and be reunited with their loved ones. We're continuing to do what we can to see whether to make sure that they are home as soon as possible, and discussing ways to accelerate that, because it is an absolute priority for us that all 3 of them be home and reunited with their loved ones.
Robert Malley, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you very much for appearing here on the France 24 interview. Thank you for watching it, and stay tuned for more news.